This is the final part to the Cold War Iceberg. If you want to see part 5, it's on my other channel, first link in the description. This is the final layer and the best layer, so let's get to it. Layer 6. Stalin analyzed Mao's poop. KGB agent Igor Atemnenko claims that in Mao's visit to Moscow in 1949, that the hotel Mao was given had been set up so that excrement Mao produced would be directed to a place where it could be collected and analyzed, rather than to the sewage system. In an interview with BBC, Igor said, if they detected high levels of amino acid, tryptophan, they concluded the person was calm and approachable, but a lack of potassium in poo was seen as a sign of nervous disposition in someone with insomnia. 1951 Pont Saint-Esprit mass poisoning. The town of Pont Saint-Esprit in France fell victim to a mass poisoning which affected over 300 residents, killing at least 7 and leaving 50 interred in an asylum. Symptoms included nausea, vomiting, and hallucinations. The investigation suspected the bakery. It believed that they had used contaminated flour, which contaminated the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which is similar to LSD. At the time, the government had total control of the wheat industry, so the bakery could only get its flour from one source. Though many have later suspected the CIA had laced the bread with LSD as part of their MK and Naomi experiments, the successor to MK Ultra. Air Force used drug bears to test ejector seats. In the 1950s, the U.S. Air Force were using bears as well as chimps as test pilots for the new B-58 Hustler. They would drug the bears and place them in a plane where they could test the ejection seat. Out of the 6 bears, 1 died, likely from a previous brain injury combined with the drugs and being flown out of the plane. The Cold War started in Canada. Though the Cold War start date continues to be debated, such as 1947 with the Truman Doctrine, Canadians say it started 3 days after the Japanese surrender in 1945. Soviet intel lieutenant Igor Kushenko worked at the Soviet embassy in Ottawa until he defected on September 5th and released documents that contained info on Soviet espionage in Canada. The Canadian Communist Party had been previously banned. In response, the Communists had created a Labour Progressive Party to front their candidates and got a member of parliament, Fred Rose, elected. In the documents Kushenko released, the Soviets had infiltrated the Canadian government and ran an entire spy network and eventually led to the arrest of Fred Rose for conspiring to steal weapons research for the Soviets. Carl Sagan was hired to nuke the moon. In 1958, the U.S. Air Force launched Project A119, a top-secret plan to nuke the surface of the moon, which could be visible from Earth and thus the people of the Soviet Union, giving the U.S. a leg up in the space race as the Soviets had been perceived as technologically superior throughout the world after launching their Sputnik satellite the previous year. A 24-year-old Carl Sagan was on the team. Soviet scalar electromagnetic weapons. I found the CIA document that has this excerpt talking about it here, and to be honest, I'm not smart enough to understand what it means, but this document is insane and will also be in the description and discusses a bunch of other things, so check that out when you want. Khrushchev barred from visiting Disneyland. In Khrushchev's 1959 visit to LA, he wished to see the magnificent Walt Disneyland, until the Americans prevented him by going due to security reasons, as they may not be able to handle a hostile crowd. Khrushchev said, "And just listen to what I was told. We, which means the American authorities, cannot guarantee your security if you go there? What is it? Is there an epidemic of cholera there or something? Or have gangsters taken over the place that can destroy me? Then what must I do? Commit suicide? This is the situation I am in, your guest. For me, the situation is inconceivable. I cannot find words to explain this to my people. Do you have rocket launching pads there?" Operation Sea Spray. On October 11, 1950, 11 San Francisco residents checked into the Sanford Hospital for urinary tract infections, which one later died. Pneumonia had also increased across the city. In a 1977 subcommittee, it was revealed that the U.S. military had performed an experiment to see how a city like San Francisco would handle a potential biological weapon attack by spraying Serratia marcescens, and Bacillus gobligi bacteria over the Bay Area. Eventual civil suits followed, in which the federal government won, and no one had been criminally charged for these tests. Democracy. Operation Tat Type, or I should say Operation Tattoo Blood Type, which is in the Korean War, soldiers had been tattooed their blood types in case of emergency blood transfusion after combat. Though this may seem reasonable, in the Midwest, public schools were tattooing elementary students with their blood type. The reason they gave was for an event of a nuclear war, though this ended in the early 50s. Starfish Prime. In 1962, after the Soviet Union had previously announced an end to the 3-year nuclear test moratorium, the U.S. decided to also ramp up nuclear testing, which included Operation Starfish Prime, which included detonating nuclear weapons in the upper atmosphere above the Pacific Ocean, which resulted in reports of auroras visible from Hawaii to New Zealand. Some have claimed the tests were trying to ignite the atmosphere. The Wired magazine said, quote, Starfish Prime was intended to test whether nuclear explosions in low Earth orbit could augment and expand the Earth-girdling Van Allen radiation belts to create a barrier that would incapacitate Soviet intercontinental missiles launched against the U.S. End quote. Another note was that just a few months prior to these tests, the first TV satellite had been launched in space called Tester 1, which had allowed the first live broadcast from the U.S. to Europe. The satellite was destroyed in the Starfish Prime tests. Frank Wisner's condom psychological warfare. Frank Wisner was a CIA intel officer who headed the Office of Policy Coordination, whose purpose was to plan covert operations in the 40s and 50s. One of the talked about plans was to send American-made condoms to the Eastern Bloc and the USSR proper, where the condoms would be very large in size in order to demoralize the communist populace to think that their ween was inferior size. Too bad this plan didn't go into effect. Also, about Frank Wisner, he eventually would be fired from the CIA and would turn his son's shotgun on himself shortly after. Dang, I don't remember writing that. Operation Mockingbird. Mockingbird was a CIA project that was a covert plan to de facto nationalize the U.S. media for propaganda pumping for their plans for the U.S. and control opposition media. The Church Committee had revealed that the CIA had infiltrated and or funded certain media outlets and influenced journalists. Carl Bernstein, a reporter who worked with the FBI to coup Nixon, reported that the CIA had owned hundreds of journalists. The term comes from Project Mockingbird, which involves the CIA wiretapping 2 journalists who had published info about assassination attempts on Castro and potentially intervention in Cuba, likely as a way to compromise them. Though never officially acknowledged by the CIA, many believe it is still active to this day, at least some form of it. Reagan and Gorbachev alien invasion plans. Gorbachev and Reagan met for the first time in Geneva in 1985 as the U.S. increased weapons spending and created the Star Wars program, whether buff or not, gave the Soviets an incentive to meet at the table as they could not compete with the spending. Though Gorbachev revealed in a 2009 interview that while talking alone and off camera, he said, President Reagan suddenly said to me, what would you do if the U.S. were suddenly attacked by outer space? Would you help us? I said, no doubt about it. He said, we too. Now I personally wonder if Reagan was genuine, or if it was another bluff to imply that the U.S. was in contact with and or aware of alien life. Operation Gladio. NATO was established to counter the Soviet Union in Europe, so they prepared in case the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe. So in conjunction with the CIA, they launched Operation Gladio, which was a backup plan in case of Western European states fell, mainly West Germany and Italy, but also others. There would be stay-behind armies that would organize resistance movements and commit anti-communist terrorism and anything imaginable to disrupt the Soviet war effort. They had weapon stockpiles around Europe, which someone used in a 1972 car bombing that killed 3, unrelated. Similar to Operation Unthinkable, soon after World War II, they planned to use it for Nazi officials in their plan. Cafe Ground Zero. In the Pentagon courtyard, there was a hot dog stand where Pentagon employees would eat at. There was what seemed to be an inside joke among the Pentagon that the Soviets were spying on the hot dog stand as the building was built around it. and how people would go to the same spot every single day for huge military briefings and was so concerned that the Reds had 2 ICBMs pointed at it at all times. The hot dog stand was torn down in 2006, or so they say. The Cold War never ended. Since the fall of the Communist Empire in 1991, many believe that since NATO and other bureaucratic agencies have lost its meaning, and in order to keep receiving government paychecks, they would have to find a new purpose. NATO, for example, has expanded since the 90s to include many of the former Soviet states and push propaganda that the modern Russian Federation is just as ambitious and dangerous as the former Soviets. Another way of looking at this was something that former KGB agent Yuri Bezmenov revealed in 1984, that the Soviet Union would infiltrate schools, activist organizations that use ideological subversion to take down the US in a long term with 4 stages: to demoralize, destabilize, crisis, and normalization. Will the ghost of the USSR end America? Thanks for watching.